This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Seneca Network from SupChina. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, and the Institute for Unfinished Research has concluded that 6 out of 10 people. My co-host is John Pazin, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and hates that hotel bath towels are so thick and fluffy that he can barely even close his suitcase. John and I discuss a research paper on learner engagement with Vocab apps. Whether you're an independent learner or a teacher, there's plenty of surprises and takeaways for you. Interviews with Jonathan Coveny, whose obsession with Chinese took him on a winding path of learning the language. Especially for all you study nerds out there, don't miss this one. All this and more, let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah in the United States.
Hey everybody, my name is John Pazin. I am in Shanghai, China, still under lockdown. How's everybody doing? Better than me, I hope.
I hope so, John. There should be a light at the end of the tunnel at some point, right?
Yep, in the meantime, my beard is growing, and my world is very small.
You're looking like an inmate, man.
All right, anyway, we've got other stuff to talk about today, thankfully.
That's right, John. Today we're talking about a research paper. I felt it's time to delve back into some of this interesting research that's coming out in the world of second language acquisition.
Okay, so the name of the paper is Stimulating Learner Engagement in App-Based L2 Vocabulary Self-Study, Goals and Feedback for Effective L2 Pedagogy. And this is by Xuehong and Shawn Loewen.
That's right. So that was a mouthful there. So let's at least translate the title of this one. So this is pretty much saying it's about engaging with apps, right? Apps to help you learn a language.
Yeah, and the thing about this paper, which threw me at first, is that it's not a paper actually aimed at helping independent learners use apps to master a language. It's more for teachers. So if you're teaching a language course and you want your students to also use an app to, to further their study outside of the classroom as part of their homework or whatever, then how are you going to stimulate engagement? How are you going to get them to really use the apps? That's what this paper's about.
So I think one of the first things that kind of struck me, John, as getting into this paper was how they first went over like all these other studies. And any good research paper is going to do this. They're going to look at other papers that were written about this subject and see, hey, what were first some takeaways? And I think the most surprising to me, John, was how there was a review of 345 studies. It was a meta-analysis paper. Pretty much what they found out is that classes that used apps for learning the language, as a part of a supplement to the class, largely resulted in people just not engaging with the app and just not really using it.
Yeah, it was a little disappointing, but it's also kind of like, well, yeah, when the teacher tells you, oh, here's this other thing which is totally optional that you can use in your studies, like who does that? Unfortunately, not many people do.
Quite so. But it wasn't even just the optional, parts of the class. There was also cited studies where, hey, they actually assigned it as part of the class. And overall, just engagement was low. It's not like nobody did it, but it's like they were talking about engagement levels of like maybe 20% of the class doing it. Some of the higher studies showed like maybe 40%, even down to like single-digit percentages of people using it.
Yeah, and these are not crappy little apps. These are well-known, like really well-funded apps like Rosetta Stone and Duolingo and Anki. Well, maybe that one's not quite as well-funded, but anyway, it's a solid app.
Yeah.
And so they're still not working. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting was at the beginning of the paper, and they start talking about motivation and engagement. And, motivation is a basis for subsequent engagement. Another quote is, motivation only indicates a student's potential for actively pursuing learning. Engagement captures the part of motivation that is converted into action. And I was like, all right, that's really cool. Motivation, engagement. But actually what it boils down to in the paper, and, it's not the researcher's fault. A paper has to have an experiment that's simple enough that you can actually do it, right? But engagement kind of comes down to how many times they use the app every day or how many words they review in the app, which is a gross simplification of engagement, but, what can you do?
Yeah, so it's, I think it definitely makes sense. Like one of these things where, hey, you're super excited about it, maybe you feel really motivated, but we've encountered individuals, or maybe we've had times like that where, yeah, we felt that motivation, but we actually ended up doing nothing, right? So, the engagement's actually following through. But I think what was interesting, and I like how they did separate this out, was that just also because you're engaged doesn't mean you might be highly motivated, or it doesn't always indicate what is motivating you.
Yeah, that's tricky and it's complex. And it's something that they attempted to target in the actual experiment. Why don't you describe the experiment for us, Jared?
You bet. So what they did is they took a class of students in Japan who were learning English. And they had about 65 students. And they randomly selected them and put them into 2 separate groups. 63 to be exact. Thanks, John. So the first group, they called the control group, and they just said, all right, we're going to give you this app, and I think they used Memrise for this study, and they said, all right, you are supposed to go onto the app and study at least 5 words every day for 5 days a week, and I think for at least 5 minutes, 5 days a week, something like that. Okay, so that was the goal. The other group, they said, all right, you guys are also going to have this Memrise app, and we want you to use it, but you have to select how many characters you're going to review every day. And we want you to make a goal of at least 5 days a week and at least 6 characters a day. So they actually said, hey, the minimum goal is higher than what was assigned to the other group. And they said, all right, so everyone got to essentially self-select and pick, hey, what is my goal? And so before the study, they gave them the TOEIC test, which is like an English proficiency test, and they gave them this test also at the end of the study, which was roughly 8 weeks. And that's what they did. That's how they ran this study.
Oh, but they were also providing feedback on the reviews and the treatment group, right?
That's right. Well, both groups had some elements of feedback. So both groups, here's what they had. They had the leaderboards. So if you've done like Memrise, Duolingo, definitely you have like those leaderboards, like you're put into like a group, if you will, and you study, and a lot of people are jockeying to try to get up that ladder. And I know my son, he does Duolingo, and he's always trying to get to first or second spot in his study group. In addition to the leaderboards, they also had this thing, unfinished lists. So it's kind of like if you didn't study, you showed up on a list, saying, oh, it's kind of, I guess, the shame and blame list, Hey, you didn't study.
You didn't hit the minimum, right?
That's right. So they know who was not doing the test or who was not doing, using the app. So these were things that both groups had, but the difference was for the experimental group, and they had this goal setting. So let's talk a little bit about this goal setting aspect and what they did.
So one of the quotes from the paper is that psychological research on goal setting theory by Locke and Latham, 1990. has found that setting specific and challenging goals together with goal-related feedback leads to better performance. Okay, so specific and challenging goals with goal-related feedback, those two things. So that was what the experiment was providing the experimental group.
And that's right, and there's a lot of research suggesting that setting goals can be really effective. And what was interesting about this review, too, is they said, hey, this is actually a pretty classic, it's an easily implemented technique, but it's like rarely adopted as a motivational strategy, specifically even with learning languages.
Right, and I got to say, this kind of makes me feel a little bit like the whole engagement thing, where it's like engagement is reduced to like, did you use the app? And in this case, goal setting is reduced to how many words are you going to review every day, right? That's the entirety of the goal. Oh, and how many days a week are you going to study, right?
Yeah.
So I can see that setting challenging goals, specific goals, we refer to SMART goals. That's a good thing, but it's just such a minimal way to do it, like a number,
Yeah, that's right. And I will say real quick as well, one of the apps we didn't mention that is cited in the study is Duolingo. I mentioned earlier about my son. But, Duolingo is very, very good at getting you to engage with the app. They have a whole bunch, those leaderboards and, different gamification aspects. They can use it, right?
Yeah, I have.
So, it has a lot of those things, but I think we'll delve into this a little bit further. there's that whole thing of just because you're engaged doesn't mean you may be highly motivated to actually learn the language. It's more of like, where's your engagement? Like, where's that coming from? Is it coming from, goals, like something you want to achieve, with the language, or is it just something, you're trying to keep up with the Joneses, on the app, or try to beat the guy on the app? Are you trying to beat the game versus, learn the language?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit conflicted. On the one hand, it's a little disappointing that the study has such a simplistic definition of engagement and goal setting. But on the other hand, if something that simple actually does have an effect on learners, then that in itself is significant. And then think about how much more, a more meaningful goal and a more engrossing engagement like will do for your studies. So it's really important to know what were the results of this experiment, right?
That's right. So here's what happened. So when they did this study, and they went for 8 weeks, they found that the group of students that set their own goals specifically, achieved much higher engagement and reviewed a whole lot more words than the group that was just assigned to use the app every day.
But the learner engagement within both groups, it actually varied quite a bit. So we're talking about the average, right?
That's right. So on average, for sure, it definitely was much higher. But you still had students in each group that didn't even use the app at all. Like, had constant days of zeros, right?
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting how, the whole leaderboard thing, some people felt motivated by it and then others hated it or just totally ignored it because, they don't care about that competition nonsense, right? I thought that was kind of interesting.
That's right. And also the unfinished list board, which, was kind of the name and shame board. Some people are like, I just didn't want to be on that list. And other people are like, it was annoying. I didn't even care about it. I didn't pay attention to it. So overall, the thing is that these things, they like the leaderboards, unfinished lists, things like that, it did provide motivation for students to go in and actually complete the tasks and use the app. And like I said, we did the group that was allowed to set their own goals, they did perform higher and they did use the app much more. Now, like I said, there was a lot of variance. So pretty much what we had is that you had more extremes, if you will. And just on average, just overall a higher engagement. But like I said, there was still a variance. But what was most interesting, John, is that I would say, okay, we're looking at the engagement, right? Were people actually engaging and using the app to study and learn new vocabulary or review vocabulary? But what actually resulted in test scores? Because I mentioned, they did the test before and after the study. And I think this is what's most interesting to me.
Surely there was a dramatic difference because the vocabulary review was so helpful.
That's right. But not. The actual test scores had no significant difference. So there was no, the group that studied more did not overall perform better on the test than the group that didn't study more.
Over 8 weeks. One of the things that I liked about this study was that they actually got some good feedback from all the learners, and they asked them how they felt about stuff. And let me quote part of the paper. Learners explained setting their own study goals gave them a sense of ownership and made them feel obliged to attain what they aimed for. So, people were very conscious of the effect of these goals they were setting, even though it was only I'm going to study, 7 words a day, 5 days a week or whatever.
And on that note, what was also important to mention is that it wasn't just like you set a goal and then, at the end of the study, did you meet your goal? No. They had classes going on and the teachers followed up with students saying, I think they were, giving feedback, how were you meeting your goal, talking to the students about their goals and, helping to give encouragement, to go ahead and meet their goal.
And I thought this was also interesting about the study. I think this is different from a lot of the learners that I know, and maybe some of the people that listen to our podcast, because they're self-motivated, they're individual, independent learners. But a lot of the people that these teachers are coming into contact with that are using the apps as part of their classes, the students expect the teachers to keep engaging with them about how they're doing in the app, and they expect it to be really brought into the classroom and made part of the discussion. And if that doesn't happen, then it just kind of gets ignored.
Exactly. And what really kind of happened here is that, the students had the ownership, but there was a level of accountability, and not just accountability, but the support that, you're describing there, John, is that, hey, we're concerned about you. We're here to help you meet your goal, right? As opposed to maybe something punitive. Oh, you didn't meet your goal. Well, now you got to go write 100 characters.
All right, so how about we try to draw some conclusions from this? How is this helpful to the listeners of our podcast who maybe are not in a class where the teacher is assigning memorize reviews as homework?
Memorize or Duolingo. Now, first, I just want to preface this, John, though, as I said, hey, there was no significant difference between these two groups on their test scores at the end of the study. But I think we should note here that when they did that test, there was less than ideal test-taking conditions. Evidently, COVID had just started, coming out, and some students had to take a test in a noisy cafeteria, and some showed up late to the test or something like that.
COVID ruins everything.
I know. So it's not a total cop out on that, but it was only they had some of those situations, and it was only 8 weeks. So, which isn't, a lot of time to really see any real significant improvement, unless you're doing something very intensive, right? But there were some other studies showing that after 10 months, hey, you did see, and people were using apps, they did see some improvement. So, okay, I just want to preface that first, okay? So that's not to say that you can see some results from apps, right? But I think one of my takeaways from this is that, hey, if you're self-studying, or even if you're part of a class, something like that, is there's the benefit in setting goals, but also having someone where you can check in with it on your goals, like have an element of accountability, right? And making sure that you're getting some feedback on how your goals are going along the way.
And I think the schools have it right, treating these apps as a supplement to the interaction in the classroom. I think that has the potential to work really well. Because I think we all know someone who only does Duolingo, and it's pretty hard to get fluent that way. You need something else, especially interaction with a human, to help you really improve. But yeah, the goal setting, definitely helpful. You can do that with a teacher. You can do that with a study buddy. It doesn't have to be as part of a study, right? So do take this conclusion to heart.
And John, you have a lot more experience in this as well, because with All Set Learning, you do this with your clients. So I think I've worked with your tutors over the years and done some classes with All Set Learning, and it's always kind of like, hey, what are your goals? What do you want to do?
Yeah, that was why this is one of the most interesting parts of the paper for me, is the part about goal theory, because I think what's really cool is when you can talk to someone about your goals and they can give you feedback on them, and then together you can kind of refine them. Because it's great to have goals, and you can come up with your own goals all day long, sure. But especially when you're not sure about your goals, sometimes you just need something to spark an idea, and then you can come up with a great goal. So, I'm not saying it has to be a certain kind of person, but just being able to discuss goals, get feedback on the goals themselves as well as on how you're progressing towards the goals, that can make a big difference.
Definitely. And, I'll add another element to this. I've been reading some other literature about, goal setting and helping with motivation. And one of the things I found was that, it's important to have, some of those long-term goals. And so, you may have that, like the effervescence goal of I want to be able to read the newspaper in Chinese someday. Okay, we have talked about that before. But it's important to have some near-term goals and really stay focused on those. So you might have that vision of where you want to be, and you could maybe couch that in terms of a vision, of kind of the where you'd like to be someday. But having that near-term goal, what can you actually achieve in the next couple weeks, in the next couple months, is something that's because it's kind of motivating, because you can see progress towards that, as opposed to some of that big goal of I want to be fluent. That's kind of amorphous, and it's hard to actually measure what does that mean.
Yeah, and we've done other podcasts on goals, so we'll link to those in the show notes. But I hope it's clear that is an important part of really getting good at Chinese.
Absolutely. And brings it back to an earlier conclusion that if you want to get fluent in Chinese, or sorry, I said the F word, John. If you want to be proficient in Chinese, it's going to take a lot more than Duolingo.
But you can learn Chinese.
All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion, Chinese graded readers.
Today we're talking about our breakthrough level book using only 150 basic characters, Xiaoming Boy Sherlock.
All right, so this is a fictional character created by Jared and me. And what we have done here is taken our Sherlock character, who is Chinese, named Gao Ming, and told the story of how he grew up in China. Well, when was that? Around 1900 something?
Early 1900s.
It's in the book. But and so he has, adventures in school, a little bit like Encyclopedia Brown. If you ever grew up, if you ever read that as a kid, I think I'm showing my age there. But
yeah, you are.
Anyway, he's one of these child geniuses that's getting into trouble and solving mysteries.
That's right. So we actually divided this story into 3 separate stories within the book, and it's a lot of fun. So you can go out and get it today. It's Xiaoming, Boy Sherlock, breakthrough level, creative reader using only 150 basic characters.
Enjoy.
All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a rave. So it's about the Chinese name of this Netflix sci-fi anthology show, Love, Death, and Robots. So so a name like this is so easy to translate, love, death, and robots. So they actually did do that for the Chinese name. But then the Chinese viewers, they decided to give the show their own nickname.
Really?
And yeah, because the show uses icons a lot. Like their icons for love, death, and robots that you sometimes see used online and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And so Chinese viewers, they gave each of the words a character. So it's ai, si, ji, and so ji meaning machine, robot. And this name, the first time you hear it, you have no idea what people are talking about. Ai, si, ji, what are you talking about? Just can't understand it. If you see the characters, then it makes a lot more sense. So anyway, stuff like this in China is fun. And of course, this show I don't think is officially, on any platforms that the government endorses because it's not the most family-friendly show. It's pretty adult. But a lot of Chinese people love it. So it's fun to see these Chinese spins that they put on the American shows.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. So, ai, si, ji. But no, it's an actual... Is the title in English or is it in Chinese?
No, it's all in English.
Oh, okay. Oh, so I'm sorry. It's an English show. I haven't even heard of the show. But I guess you're saying they've got it dubbed into...
Guess you're not into sci-fi. It's season 3. Season 3 came out this year.
I missed the boat. I've missed the boat. But hey, that sounds like a lot of fun. Well, we'll have to check it out.
All right. Don't watch it with the kids. You will be sorry. All right. So, Jared, you got a rant or a rave?
All right. I've got a rant. And it's couched a little bit in a rave. So something I see frequently on some of these subreddit forums about learning Chinese is people are always, writing characters, handwriting characters, and posting on the picture and saying, "How's my handwriting doing? How's this going?" And always gets lots of upvotes, and people are like, "Oh, it's going well. Keep going." And it's like it gives that impression of oh, you have to learn to handwrite characters. So I, being the person I am, I found a picture that came up on Facebook on one of my memories, and it was when I was at a government office back in Shanghai taking care of something with an employee with one of my businesses, and I had to fill out a form in Chinese. And I realized, looking at this form in this picture, this was the last time I needed to handwrite characters. And you want to know what that date was, John?
I do.
March 1st, 2017. It was 5 years ago. Over 5 years ago was the last time I actually needed to handwrite characters.
All right, well, to be fair, you did leave China.
I did leave China, but most people listening to this podcast are not in China. And since I've been back in America, I really haven't had that need. And I think even when I've been in China, like I said, the only times I really needed to handwrite characters is doing this, like filling out some sort of government form. Yeah,
me too. Filling out random forms. I can't even remember when the last time it happened was, but I know it's been this year.
So, but even so, being this year, so you've only really needed to handwrite characters maybe once this year, once or twice?
Maybe, yeah.
So there you go. So anyway, so that's about my rant, is saying that, there's all those people, showing these pictures. And so I showed my own picture about handwriting characters and like, hey, this was like 5 years ago. So, hey, you don't need to learn to handwrite, or you can learn to handwrite. I once again, we always advocate that. Yeah, sure, go ahead and learn how to do it, but don't spend like hours filling books with, characters that you're copying over and over and over, because it's just...
Unless you like to because it's fun for you, in which case, more power to you.
Is it fun for you, John?
No.
Then don't do it.
Okay.
I'm Jonathan Coveny, but a lot of people call me J-Co.
A few years ago, we wrote an article about Jonathan's story of learning Chinese on MandarinCompanion.com. There's a link in the show notes, but this interview covers entirely new ground.
I live in Guilin, China, where I've lived for going on 5 years now. I'm very passionate about Chinese and Chinese media and the Chinese language, and full of opinions.
Jonathan's achieved an advanced level of Chinese due to persistence and, at times, sheer grit. In our chat, he reflected on how he learned Chinese compared to what he knows now about learning Chinese. Stay with us. All right, Jonathan, why did you start learning Chinese?
There were two reasons, and they kind of fed off of each other. The most immediate was my ex-girlfriend. Her family was originally from Shanghai, actually, but they moved to the States, and that's where she grew up and everything. We were pretty serious, and we hung out with her family a lot. And, it was clear that if I wanted to have a relationship with her family, independent of her translating in a huff because she didn't really enjoy that role, which is totally fair, I was going to need to learn a language that I could use to communicate with them. And I use that wording just because they were from Shanghai. So if I wanted the perfect one, it would have been Shanghainese, which in her parents' case, their Shanghainese was way better than their Mandarin at this point, because since they left China, they didn't really need to use as much Mandarin as they would have if they had stayed in China. Whereas they kind of had this Shanghainese community in New York that they spoke a lot of Shanghainese with. They definitely could speak Mandarin, but their Shanghainese was, number one, which I thought was really cool. And New York is kind of amazing in that way, that you can find these kind of niche communities. So I'm currently 35. I started learning Mandarin at 28, 29. And I had moved to New York. I had a job there. Things were going well. And the situation with my ex-girlfriend kind of came at the right time. I've always had an interest in Chinese culture, in college and afterwards. I had a lot of friends either from China or whose parents were from China. So there was always kind of a interest there in China and the Chinese language. And so it was at a time when I felt like I had a lot of free time, a lot of energy outside of work. And then it's like, okay, I'm in a pretty serious relationship. Her parents don't really speak very good English. And it's kind of funny because in college, I kind of made a vow, and that vow was I will never learn Chinese. I will never learn a tonal language. I will never learn a language that uses the Chinese characters, because I was just like, it's just too hard. I'm not smart enough. I don't want to do that to myself. So, of course, here I am, year 5 in China, and, kind of grappling with the language.
The irony.
It is ironic, but it's a fun irony.
That is great. I'm curious just to know a little bit more about this. You say, it was just time to start learning Chinese, and you strike me as someone who likes a challenge, right?
Yeah.
Is that maybe something as well that kind of drew you into Chinese?
That's not why I started, but I think that's why I continued. Language, and especially Chinese, there's just so many different angles that you can focus on and that provide different forms of enrichment. Conversation and literacy and watching a TV show, listening to an audiobook, doing calligraphy, writing. These are all things that are related to each other, but they also kind of can scratch different itches. You can kind of focus on them in different ways to different degrees. You can do different things with them. So especially once you get to an intermediate level and definitely to an advanced level, language study is no longer just studying the language, learning grammar, learning vocabulary, grappling with textbooks or whatever, or, reading y'all's amazing books, which, me and my other Chinese learning friends are always praising. And just for the listeners, they didn't tell me to say that. This is straight from the heart.
I'll send you your tip
Yeah,
later.
exactly. So I think there's a lot of different things that you can do with language, but the further on you get with it, it becomes a tool to do the things that you want, which is a lot of fun, right? Like at this point, where I've spent a lot of time learning Chinese and I feel like I can do a lot of the things I want to do with it, what I think feels different at this stage versus when I was more actively, let's say, learning Chinese in quotes, is that now my biology in Chinese is awful. Like if I wanted to describe mitochondria and ADP and all this biology stuff that I learned in high school in Chinese, I would be terrible at it. But it's not really like a language issue, right? It's not I don't remember how to use le in this case, or, oh, what's the word for to express or whatever. It's the same as any topic I wouldn't know in English. Like I would find a book, maybe like a popular explainer on biology, and then I would read it, and there would be some terms I wouldn't know, but it wouldn't feel overwhelming in the way that it did early on. It feels a lot more like it feels in English, where it's just like, oh, that's just a topic I don't know. There's some technical jargon. And I love that feeling. I think that that's a super amazing thing to feel.
I appreciate you framing it like that, because too often learners we're going about the language and it's always about what we don't know. There's always stuff you're not going to know, but as you're bringing it up there, Jonathan, it's like, well, there's things in English you're not going to know, and you can approach it largely the same way once you hit a certain level in Chinese.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes it a lot less, let's say, depressing, because it can be tough. It can be really tough when you feel like you're so far away. But I think also just remembering there's no real endpoint. I think Chinese is a great example where different people in different places with different backgrounds have such different relationships to the Chinese language, the Chinese writing system, Chinese history. And to me, I think that kind of helps ground me. I mean, there are people whose accents and grammar are better than mine will ever be in Chinese, but maybe they haven't read a bunch of wuxia novels and they know nothing about the genre, because that's something that I am passionate about and they're not. I mean, I don't know much about chemistry in English, but if I did, I could spend 6 months, a year, 5 years, it could become a passion. And in Chinese, it's the same way. It's just, I think, you get educated in your native language, and so it makes it sound like it's a bad thing. But it's, the system kind of has a general set of knowledge that it assumes you should know. Like as an American who grew up in Texas, I know about the Alamo, right? Remember the Alamo.
Yeah.
You got to know that. And, a Chinese person learning English could be extremely fluent, but know nothing about the Alamo. And it's just that's fine. But maybe they then load up the Wikipedia article on the Alamo, and okay, now they know about the Alamo.
Oh, now I know.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Listeners, don't forget, you got to remember the Alamo. That's the rule.
Well, Jonathan, I want to delve a little bit into how you went about learning. And I think this is going to be a great subject to hear from you, because you have approached language learning from, I know, multiple angles. I think how you learned the language, but versus how you might actually think would have been better
for sure
to do it at different times.
For sure. Absolutely. There were a lot of lessons from it. And, I've still kept in touch with people at various stages in learning languages, including Mandarin. And actually, Jonathan Becker, who you had on the show, is a good friend of mine. So we've chatted a ton about learning Mandarin. And, I think he's gotten a lot from my experience, but actually I've also learned a lot. I had no idea how to tackle Chinese, to be honest. I had learned Spanish the weird casual way that people do when they studied a little of a language in middle school and high school, and then they get serious about it afterwards, especially with the writing system. That was a part of Chinese that I just didn't know how to tackle. One advantage is it had kind of been a while since I had tried to study a language. I was more mature as a person and a learner. So I really was okay, I'm going to do it right. So I really took a kitchen sink approach. Trend through my studies, both of Mandarin and Japanese, is I like to work with a lot of different teachers, especially for Mandarin, where there's a lot of different regions and regional accents. Of course, teachers are all going to generally speak standard Mandarin. Still, different people have different ways of expressing themselves. They have different regionalisms. They have different backgrounds, different interests. So even excluding pronunciation or whatever, I find it really important. Make sure you're at least talking to different types of people, and that could be age group, background, region, whatever. Because if you just work with one person, you develop your own little language with them. They get used to your quirks. They get used to your accent. They get used to everything. But then when you speak to someone who's not a teacher, for example, and you find out, oh, my third tone is bad. every time you use a word that has it, they don't understand. That's really valuable feedback.
It's sometimes like a parent talking to a toddler. I've got a 3-year-old and, he says something and most people can't understand it. And I'm like, oh yeah, he wants some grapes.
Exactly.
Like
it's exactly like that. So I really wanted to do everything I could to have as diverse a possible source of conversation and input. And for me personally, when I study a language, and Mandarin was no exception, conversation is by far my biggest priority. After that is being able to consume native media. And then, it's kind of like writing, output, etc. I mean, if you want to do them, that's great. If you don't, but for me, conversation is really the root, the key interest.
That's what you're focused on, right?
Yeah, that's what I was most focused on initially. Because after I came to China, it was all literacy all the time. But really before that, conversation was the biggest priority. But, I kind of started in a pretty traditional way. I found a teacher in New York who was a very lovely person who we kind of started working through the integrated Chinese series, and I ended up getting very intense. What I mean by intense is when I first moved to China, I was doing 20 hours a week at the Chinese Languages Institute in Guilin, where I still live. And outside of that, I was doing 4 to 8 hours a day of flashcards.
Wow.
It's kind of amazing that I was able to meet my now wife at the time. I sometimes wonder how that went, but I kind of took a break when I first met her, actually, but then I was like, no, I got to get back on it. So then I was still doing a ton of flashcards. And at the time, that was with an app called Skritter. And then eventually I declared bankruptcy, which is not an uncommon thing, flashcard bankruptcy. And then I started using Anki, which is another flashcard app. There was like a 6-month period, again, where I was doing like 8 hours of flashcards a day. Just kind of every waking moment was spent on Chinese study. When you're in China, it's easier because if you go to eat, you can kind of say that's Chinese study, but it was intense.
If you put in that time, in that effort, it's going to produce results, right? But looking back, what would you have done differently in that situation?
So, this is where I got to give the shout out to my man, Jonathan Becker.
Anyone listening, if you want to listen to his podcast, it's episode 61.
There's a lot more communities around learning Chinese now. I think more healthy approaches. I have a very large passive vocabulary, and that's fun. It's like a parlor trick, My wife uses me as a character dictionary. Like, she's too lazy to look it up on her phone. She doesn't want to write it. She asks me. But I think at some point, it's like I had to admit to myself, like, this is no longer language study. This is just like a perverse hobby that I've developed. And I think Anki is a great tool, and I definitely don't regret using it. But I think, you got to be really strategic with how you spend that time. Because even if your goal is to learn everything, there's different ways to go about that, and there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different places that you can learn new words and new ideas. And Anki is a very useful tool for making sure that you can kind of maintain a passive vocabulary. But, well, it's just not a lot of fun. People kind of struggle with that. So I think that that's really important. It's not the best way to create associations with those words, with those ideas. There are people who have techniques, et cetera, to do that. But I think at the end of the day, when you read a book or you watch a TV show or you listen to an audiobook, you're going to be bombarded with a lot of new words, and that's overwhelming. Of course, that's why y'all have the Mandarin Companion series, and it's really amazing. But at some point, you take the plunge with more media, and it can be a bit overwhelming. But I can remember when I first heard a word, like, oh yeah, it was in that book that I read that word, or it was in that story that person had this character in their name and stuff like that. Those characters, those words are much, much, much easier to remember. I want to know it all, and I want to know it immediately, and I'm willing to accept boring 6 months, a very painful 6 months, if it'll get me there or something. I've met a lot of people since then who, they're really interested in, various forms of Chinese media, and yeah, they use Anki, but they spend a lot more of that time consuming the media. And it's a trade-off. I made a lot of very quick but painful progress, but I see the people who are much more focused earlier on, consuming a lot more content, and they just have a lot less pressure. They're having more fun with the language. They're building those associations with words, ideas, grammar a lot earlier on. In the spirit of Mandarin Companion, right? Whatever book you want to read takes a long time. It's okay if you don't understand everything. It's okay if you reading this book feels very different from when you read things in English. kind of accepting that feeling, and just being like, if this book is really good and you feel like you didn't get as much out of it as you think you can read it again,
Totally.
I was always interested in the wuxia genre. If I had read one of those books at an intermediate level, there would have been a lot I wouldn't have understood. But that's okay, because there would have been a lot I would have understood. And then I could have just reread it again.
Of like flashcards, right? Is kind of a bunch, but one of the options of that is that you're learning those words in isolation. They're siloed, right? And that you're not having that connection, the context. I mean, I have to put a link term, right? It's low context, and it doesn't really show you how they all work together.
Yeah, there are people reading books in Anki. I personally, that's not for me. But at the end of the day, just having a healthier mindset about the process. My man Becker, that's what I call him. He just has such a healthier relationship to Mandarin than I do. And it's great. It reminds me what learning a language can be like. Because for me, honestly, I'm kind of traumatized from it. Like, people are like, oh, what language are you going to do next? And I'm like, just, no, never again. Like, they're like, oh, but weren't you talking about, you're interested in French or maybe Korean? It's like, no, never again. Like, never. And I think that's bad. I think that's really sad. I mean, the languages I speak are really great, and I think it'll be good to spend time just focusing on enjoying those languages and maybe improving in areas that I want to improve. But my way of learning, even if it was effective in some ways, if it kind of traumatized me out of wanting to learn languages, maybe it was a little extreme. I just keep bringing up Jonathan because I think he's doing such a good job, because he's made the process so much more fun.
Mm-hmm.
I was terrified to use my Chinese, even when I was at a rather advanced level. I was just like, I'm not good enough. I'm going to be annoying to talk to or whatever. But he is out there, and, he lives in LA, and he's finding people to talk to. He's finding people at college. He's finding people in LA, and he's not doing it in some kind of creepy YouTuber way where he's like dropping in on middle-aged women and like, oh, look at how good my Mandarin is, Like, these are people who make it clear that they're excited to talk to him, and he's just had like so many great experiences with the language. And, he speaks good Mandarin, but he hasn't been studying that long. Like, when I was studying just for a year, I would not dare to use Mandarin, and I lived in New York, Having that healthy attitude, making the language fun, leaning into the things that make the language fun, and just kind of accepting that it's a humble experience where you're not going to have the level of facility that you maybe wish you did. It's like, you'll get there, but the process can be fun.
I think that highlights the second point that I kind of see in your story here is the importance of like enjoyment in what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Like you say, if you had taken some of that time of, you're doing all the flashcards, but you actually maybe started consuming some media, reading, watching things, stuff like that, is that motivation, if you're enjoying that, it can take you really far, even through those painful processes.
Absolutely.
There are other guys who have gone through like that very painful process of learning Chinese. But the thing about it is that you didn't have to have that much pain, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't necessary to go through that painful process. And to a degree, there are some people that they see those people that went through that painful process, and it's kind of like, oh, well, I've got to do that too if I really want to learn language. But the reality is, for any one person who went through that much pain to learn the language, there's probably 500 who did quit along the way, right?
And I see that all the time with how people kind of construct their goals. To me, that's something that's really important. And I do think that's one area where I've generally been pretty good, even if sometimes the way I achieve those goals was a little pathological. I've seen a lot of students is a tendency to approach languages, and I always call it aesthetically. And what I mean by that is we bring a lot of judgments, like aesthetic judgments, to what it means to be proficient in a language. I'll give a concrete example. Reddit is terrible, and I try not to use it anymore. But so many people have called me a liar there because I'm like, I can read a book without a dictionary, but I can probably write 400 characters. And they're just like, that's impossible. There's no way. And I was like, okay, yeah, I guess it is, Mr. Reddit guy. For me, I was able to sit down and just kind of make a decision that I didn't want to prioritize writing for various reasons, and I did want to prioritize reading, and then I kind of adjusted my study accordingly. I see a lot of students who have this kind of intellectually driven idea of what it means to be like good at Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
But then those aren't necessarily things that actually bring them joy, right? Like for me, I knew that conversation brought me joy. So I focused really hard on getting good at conversation. Actually, at one point, At the very beginning of my studies, I was studying very traditionally. I was writing, I was learning the characters, I was going along with the integrated Chinese. I was like, you know what, I'm not going to learn how to write. That's not a priority for me. For a long time, I dropped characters completely. So I had a bunch of flashcards that were pinyin sentences. And this is like anathema in the Chinese and Japanese language learning community. Like pinyin flashcards, that's madness.
Yeah, there's definitely a case for it, though. I wouldn't totally poo-poo it, right?
I'm not arguing for that strategy per se, but what I am arguing is that I knew that conversation was going to make me keep going with Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can learn the characters eventually, but if I can't talk to people, I'm going to get burnt out, because talking to people in a new language just brings me a ton of joy. So I made that decision based on what I knew about myself and what would motivate me. And what I try and encourage people to do is really think hard about what you care about, because it's so easy to convince yourself that, like, yeah, of course, I want to have the exact same knowledge that I have in English in Chinese, or I want to be the equivalent of what I would have been if I'd grown up in China. That sort of thing, right? So there's a lot of like, oh, you can't write? That's horrible, you're illiterate. And it's like, who cares?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, languages are tools. You know, they let you do things. And, you know, they'll be very impressed if you have, I don't know, read any classical Chinese at all. They're like, oh, you like Wu Xiao? Like, you like those stories? Oh, well, that's okay. Yeah, Jin Yang, he's cool. But, oh, what, you like Xian Xia stories? Like, oh, that's trash. You know, like, because we also make these judgments, right? Like, in America, at least, for a long time, people might look down on young adult fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Or they might look down on romance or these sorts of things. But these are things that bring a lot of joy to a lot of people, you know? Like, if someone learning English is really into romance, like, that's awesome to me, right? Like, in China, there's like a super popular genre of fiction, which is boy love fiction, danmei, and it spawned a lot of really popular TV shows, like one called The Untamed. And there's like multiple communities that are fans of this genre, and they are really good about reading a lot, like, because they're super passionate about this genre of fiction. So they don't want to be doing flashcards, you know, they want to be reading the book. I mean, they're very popular in China, but like, if you were to ask my mother-in-law, she would be like, well, I probably wouldn't talk about that with her, but she would just think it was a waste of time. Like, why aren't you spending more time on the classical Chinese, you know, that sort of thing. So I just think it's really important to be honest with yourself about what is important, because it's so easy to convince yourself that you should be focusing on things that don't actually make you excited about the language. I know a lot of heritage speakers of Chinese, and I think a lot of them struggle with this because, you know, in my friends' cases, their parents would be like, why can't you read Chinese? But they're just not motivated by it. That's not what excites them. And that's fine, you know. They can do so many amazing things with the Chinese language that, like, if you can't read and you're not excited about reading, you know, just be honest with yourself. But if you're excited about reading, you can read.
It underscores the importance of having like your motivation and having kind of your goals aligned with that. There's this email I had gotten from a reader, and we had a few exchanges back and forth, and he was preparing to take like the HSK4. That was his goal. But after emails back and forth and talking about this, he's like, you know what? I realized the HSK, it's not even important to me.
Yeah.
You know, it's some arbitrary thing. So he's ditched it, and now he's pursuing what he wanted to learn, and he was enjoying it.
And I think that's awesome. A lot of students are exactly like that person, and I think that is really great, where they can just admit, like, I don't need to take this test. I'm just going to follow what excites me about the language. Other people want that structure. They need that structure. And they're excited about having a really concrete test they can prepare for. To me, the key is just making that decision for yourself.
Absolutely.
Every Chinese teacher I've had, when I'm like, nope, I cannot write by hand, every single one has made like this priceless, tortured face. But it's fine, you know?
It's fine. I did make a post recently. It was about the last time I needed to handwrite characters, and it was in March of 2017. I had a picture of it. I was at some office dealing some documents for my business there, and I'm like, this has been 5 years. That's the last time I needed to actually handwrite characters, and it was just a handful of characters that I had to look up anyway.
I don't want the pro character people to come at me, but make that decision because it's something that motivates you, that makes you excited about the language.
If you love writing, it's something you're passionate about, you just want to be able to handwrite because that's what you love to do it.
And Chinese people will think you are amazing.
That's right.
When you bust out your handwriting at a table full of aunties and uncles, they are going to just adore you. They will not adore me in the way that they will adore you if you can write by hand. But I'm okay with giving up that adoration.
Well, Jonathan, bringing this all together, what concrete advice would you give to someone who's just starting to learn right now?
As someone who spent a lot of time thinking about how to learn efficiently, there's how much time you put into it, and then there's how much you get out of the time you put into it, right? So that's what efficiency is. But, if you put no time into it, no matter how efficient your methods are, you're going to get nothing out of it. So, I think some people get overwhelmed, understandably, because it's a big endeavor. Like, how should I be studying? What should I be doing? What's the perfect textbook? What's the perfect method? And when you start out, you are not going to have the perfect method. So what I think is much more important is listen to yourself. Put time into it and then just tweak. As you learn, just ask yourself and kind of analyze what's working and what's not. But don't kind of get too obsessed or too overwhelmed by, is this like the exact right way to do it, or am I going to get there in the end? I mean, if you put the time into it, you will get there 100%. People will say that some people have an innate talent for it or whatever. I think that talent counts for way less than just putting in the time necessary. And yeah, good study habits. But like, if you put in the time and over time kind of tweak, you're going to get to a great place. And I think that that's the key. Is something that I struggle with, which is just accepting that it's a process like that. You can start out with the wrong textbook series, and maybe, you spend a few months or even half a year on one textbook series, and then you decide, you know what, I think this other textbook series might be better. You've still learned something. You've still learned some Chinese. You still have more experience with the language, and then you switch textbooks, and then you keep learning. And you're also learning what sort of studying works for you. Because when you can make that judgment, like, oh, this textbook isn't working for me, but this textbook is, like, that means you now know more about yourself as a student, right? Yeah. And so when you start reading things like Mandarin Companion, you might find that really is really exciting, that it feels really great, right? And of course, it's a shame that there aren't just, a million different Mandarin Companion stories at a million different levels. That would be amazing.
Someday.
But, if someone can read that Mandarin Companion breakthrough and feel really excited about Mandarin, feel really excited about reading, and then study a bit more, read the next level, study a bit more, read the next level. And each time they really feel something as they read these stories, excitement about the language, excitement about what they're reading. To me, that says, okay, well, what do you know now? Like, you know that you are a person who is excited about reading in Mandarin. It's hard, but now you know that about yourself. I mean, I remember when I read Great Expectations in the Mandarin Companion. Was that y'all's first level 2?
It was, our first level 2.
So, and I was super excited about it. And I honestly cried. And it's a good story. Dickens, a lot of people hate him because they had to read him in high school, but the man could create melodrama. But also just the fact that I could be moved in Chinese was extremely moving. I was engaging with a story in Chinese that was making me feel all of the emotions that a good story makes you feel. That was just really overwhelming. That experience helped reaffirm for me, okay, this is worth it. I don't know exactly how I'm going to get there in the end, but being able to read books in Mandarin is something that, I want to be able to do. And I've been listening to audiobooks now, which, nothing will ever make me feel as proud of my own studies as that does. It feels really, truly incredible. But I walk every day, and I was walking and listening to this audiobook, and I was tearing up on my walk. Just because the book was at this really exciting, moving part where things were coming together, and it's wow, I started this language and I was 29,
Yeah, that's amazing. Really cool.
Make it fun, be honest with yourself, and you can always tweak as you go. There's a lot of great resources, a lot of great communities, but just focus on putting time and make it a part of your life, a fun part of your life. If you want to add in flashcards, you can add in flashcards. If you want to take them out, you can take them out. If you want to read more, you can read more. If you want to take a break from reading and focus on conversation, you can do that. But as long as Mandarin is a fun and interesting and motivating part of your life, you're going to get there. Other people might do it in 3 years. Other people might do it in 5. Other people might do it in 10. Other people might do it in 20. But it's not a race. As long as it's fun the whole way, you're going to enjoy it. You're going to enjoy the journey.
That is really insightful, and I appreciate you sharing that experience because you've been through a wide range of experiences in learning the language and approached it from a lot of different angles, and it's great to hear you kind of pull that all together for that piece of advice. Jonathan, I really appreciate you taking the time to share this perspective with us, and it's been really insightful, and I appreciate taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pleasure.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, mechanic, candidate, farmer, mason, pilot, lawyer, singer, coach, painter, and that one guy named Harry. You can subscribe in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mannercompanion.com or tag us on social media, #MannerCompanion. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Guo at SupChina, and our interview editor is Dominic Edgley. I'd like to thank our guest interview, Jonathan Coveny, and of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Paston. See you next time.